The line between dignity and dismissal can be thinner than a laminated badge. Justice Elijah Brooks stood silently at the end of the VIP access line at the Hamilton National Legal Conference, his credentials in hand, while the gate agent's eyes flicked between his face and the card with measured doubt. It was subtle, but years on the federal bench had sharpened Elijah's senses to microaggressions that, while masked in protocol, rang unmistakably familiar. 25 attendees waited behind him. Their impatience curled around the air like humidity, and still, the agent scrutinized the name printed in bold. Justice Elijah D. Brooks' keynote. Her brows tightened just slightly. "I'm going to need some additional identification," she said, her tone clipped and public, like an overhead announcement of suspicion. Justice Brooks remained composed, though he could feel a slow burn rising beneath the surface of his tailored suit. His keynote speech, titled Restoring Trust, Equity in the Judiciary, was scheduled to begin in under 2 hours. It was a culmination of 40 years in law, 22 as a prosecutor, and 18 on the bench. Yet none of that seemed to matter at this moment. He reached into his coat pocket for his government-issued ID and slid it across the counter. The agent, her name, tag read C. Winters, lifted it, examined it too long, then said, "This doesn't indicate your judicial status." A low murmur rumbled from a line behind him. Justice Brooks didn't want to escalate, but the knot in his stomach had tightened into something sharper. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern familiar, exhausting, undeniable. And while his instinct leaned toward restraint, he knew that silence wasn't always the honorable choice. He took out his phone and scrolled to a contact labeled simply Chief J. Simmons. He'd never used this number outside of formal judicial business, but this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the message he was due to deliver to a room full of decision-makers, many of whom would never be stopped at a podium, never be asked for more than a glance. "I'm making a call," he said calmly to Winters, who only raised an eyebrow. On the second ring, a familiar voice answered. "Brooks, everything all right?" "Not quite," Elijah replied, aware that others nearby had quieted. "I'm at the VIP desk and being denied my access pass. Apparently, my credentials aren't convincing enough." "What?" The chief's voice grew sharp. "Hand the phone to whoever's responsible." Elijah passed it to Winters. Her posture shifted, suddenly rigid. "Yes, sir. Yes, I see." "No, that won't be necessary, sir." "I understand." She handed the phone back with trembling fingers and barely met his eyes. Justice Brooks turned slightly to take the call. "Understood. Thank you." He turned back to find Winters hastily preparing a new pass, her face pale. Just as she extended it to him, a man in a navy blazer bearing the conference emblem approached. "Justice Brooks, I'm Malcolm Drayton, Executive Coordinator. I'm so sorry about this incident. Please allow me to escort you to the speaker's lounge personally." Behind them, Winters stood frozen. Drayton turned to her. "MS. Winters, HR is requesting you immediately." "But Now." The crowd's silence was deafening. Elijah said nothing. He followed Drayton through the glass atrium into the lounge, where fresh coffee and printed agendas waited on polished tables. But what stayed with him wasn't the pass or the apology. It was the sting of proving himself again. He delivered his keynote that afternoon to a full room, his voice steady as he wove statistics with lived experience. And then, without ceremony, he recounted what had happened just hours earlier. Not to shame, but to illuminate. "I was challenged today," he said. "Not because of a policy, not because of an error, but because I didn't look the part. I ask you how many others are denied entry to rooms like this, not for lack of qualification, but for lack of assumption." The room rose to its feet in ovation. Yet the applause couldn't quiet the question burning inside him. What happens to the ones who don't have a direct line to the Chief Justice? 6 months later, that question became a policy. Justice Brooks chaired a new committee, the National Equity and Access Commission. Its mission was to audit, retrain, and reform access policies in courthouses and legal events nationwide. The first person to complete the committee's new bias education initiative? Cynthia Winters. She sent a letter addressed to Justice Brooks. I had no right to question your status that day. But your decision to give me a second chance has changed my understanding of the systems I once upheld blindly. Justice Brooks didn't respond immediately. He waited until her application arrived for a public service role within the federal court's community access team, a position she now qualified for, post-training. He approved it, not because she'd been humbled, but because she'd chosen to learn. And that, he thought, was where justice began, not just in holding people accountable, but in making space for transformation. One credential at a time, one choice at a time, one quiet confrontation that changes the conversation forever. It had been exactly 1 year since the Madison Conference. Justice Elijah Brooks stood once more before a packed auditorium, this time not as a keynote speaker, but as chair of the National Equity and Access Commission, a role he hadn't sought but had grown into with the weight of purpose. The morning light filtered through the arched windows of the Washington Convention Hall, casting long rays across polished parquet floors and rows of seated legal professionals. Beside him, a stack of manila folders detailed the committee's first year of work, reforms enacted, cases reviewed, trainings implemented. But what mattered more to Elijah wasn't in the statistics. It was in the quiet, sometimes unremarkable changes that rippled outward, changes no graph could properly show. One such ripple walked into his office 3 weeks ago. "I'm nervous," Cynthia Winters had said, standing before him with a clipboard in her hand and a humility in her eyes that hadn't existed a year prior. She'd worn her mistakes like a badge, one she didn't try to hide from. After completing the court's bias rehabilitation program and excelling in public accessibility work, she'd asked for a chance to join the very committee Elijah led. "I don't want redemption," she had said. "I want to contribute." And now she did. Today, she sat in the front row, not as a symbol of shame, but as living proof of the initiative's deepest potential, growth. Elijah adjusted the microphone and began his address. "This past year, we've talked a lot about access. We've made progress. But if you think equity is a checklist, something you tick off and move on from, you've misunderstood the mission. Equity isn't a destination. It's a posture, a vigilance. It's the humility to admit that we're never done learning." He scanned the audience. There were more diverse faces than the year before, more first-time attendees, more people like the young law student he'd once met in a rideshare car named Jamal, now standing in the wings with a conference intern badge and a folder full of law school admissions essays. In the weeks following the Madison incident, Elijah had written him a recommendation. Today, Jamal was a 1L Howard. But even as Elijah spoke, he knew the road ahead remained uneven. Just last month, the committee reviewed a case from a courthouse in Georgia where a Latina public defender had been mistaken for a translator twice in the same week. In California, a Sikh attorney was asked to remove his turban by courthouse security despite ID and a bar card. It was still happening, and that was why he stood here, not to boast, but to remind everyone that vigilance mattered more than victory laps. "I want to tell you a story," he said midway through the speech, setting aside his prepared remarks. "A week ago, a teenage boy came into a courthouse in Ohio. His clothes were too big, his hair braided down his back. He was there to observe a trial for a school civics assignment. Security pulled him aside, asked him what he was really doing there, made him empty his pockets. The judge in that courthouse heard about it, and she didn't brush it aside. She called him into chambers, sat him down, let him watch the trial beside her bench, with explanation, with care. She rewrote the experience in real time. The audience was quiet, listening. That's what we're building. Not perfection, but a culture where harm, once identified, is interrupted, where correction becomes part of the process, not just punishment." Elijah's voice didn't waver. He wasn't angry. He was resolute. After the conference, back in his chambers in D.C., he received a letter in the Mila handwritten note from a woman he didn't recognize. "Dear Justice Brooks," it read. "You don't know me, but I was seated 4 rows behind you at last year's keynote. I'm a court clerk in Minnesota. I've worked in the system for 30 years. After hearing you speak, I asked to attend our court's first equity training. I was resistant at first. Defensive, if I'm being honest. But I stayed. I listened. I cried. I changed. Thank you for planting that seed. Elijah tucked the note into a leather-bound folder where he kept mementos too personal for public display. It joined Jamal's acceptance letter, a photo of Eliza Turner's father cutting the ribbon on his Stroke Survivor Mentorship Center, and one other item. A new VIP badge. Not his. Cynthia Winters. It was mailed with a sticky note, for when I earn the invitation. Until then, I'll be working behind the scenes. She hadn't asked for a seat at the podium, but Elijah had plans for her. 3 weeks after the conference, Cynthia sat across from him again, this time in the committee's private boardroom in D.C. "I'd like you to co-author the next training module," he said without preamble. Her eyes widened. "Me? You," he repeated. "You know where the blind spots are. I need your insight, not just as someone who made a mistake, but as someone who grew from it." That afternoon, they began drafting what would become the Prospective Pathways Initiativia program, requiring all federal court employees to rotate through a shadowing cycle. 1 week observing the roles they most misunderstood. Security guards shadowing clerks. Judges attending public service counters. Agents spending time in legal aid clinics. Empathy by immersion, Elijah said. "It's uncomfortable," Cynthia said. Exactly. By the time the second anniversary of the Madison incident arrived, the program had rolled out in 7 circuits. The incident that had nearly become a stain on Elijah's legacy was now the foundation of a national transformation. And he knew it wasn't over. One afternoon, as he left the courthouse, Elijah noticed a teenager on the front steps with a clipboard and a trembling voice, asking passersby if they'd sign a petition to fund free legal clinics for underserved neighborhoods. She looked barely 16, full of urgency and nerves. He paused, then asked, "How many signatures do you need?" 300, she said, not looking up. He signed. Then he asked, "Want a few more?" She looked up at last. "Yuri, wait, aren't you the judge from the videos?" "I am," he said. "But today, I'm someone who knows a few people. Let's get you those signatures." They walked the plaza together for 20 minutes. She spoke. He listened. When they parted, she had over 70 names. It reminded him of Christine, his late wife. She used to say, "Justice isn't always served in a courtroom. Sometimes, it's just someone showing up at the right moment." That night, Elijah sat in his home office, looking at the photo of Christine on the shelf. "The movement's still growing, sweetheart," he said softly. "One ripple at a time." And somewhere across town, in a public library, Jamal opened his criminal law textbook, paused to reread a highlighted quote from Brooks' keynote, and underlined it twice. "True equity doesn't arrive when the powerful make room. It arrives when everyone forgets there ever was a door to open in the first place."